Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Millfield, Pennsylvania. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. In the autumn of 1892, the discovery of an abandoned trunk in the attic of the Raines family estate sent ripples through the quiet community of Millfield, Pennsylvania. The weathered leather case, secured with 3 separate locks, contained nothing but a collection of pressed flowers, a series of unmarked photographs, and a journal belonging to a woman named Evelyn Raines, a woman who, according to township records, had never existed. What began as a curious footnote in local history would eventually unravel into one of the most disturbing cases of psychological manipulation and calculated deception ever documented in the region. This is the story of a woman who vanished not once but twice, first from society and then from history itself. The Raines estate stood at the end of Oak Hollow Road, approximately 3 miles from Millfield's town center. Built in 1847 by coal baron Thomas Raines, the Victorian mansion featured distinctive gabled roofs, ornate woodwork, and large windows that seemed to watch visitors approach along the elm-lined driveway. By all accounts, the Raines family was respected, if somewhat removed from the social fabric of Millfield. Thomas Raines had made his fortune in the anthracite coal fields of northeastern Pennsylvania, though business associates noted his reluctance to discuss the early days of his wealth acquisition. The mansion itself, a 3-story structure of imposing gray stone, was positioned on a slight rise, allowing it to dominate the surrounding landscape. Local lore held that Thomas had specifically selected the location to ensure his home would be visible from the town square, a constant reminder of his prominence in the community. The household consisted of Thomas, his wife Eleanor, their son Benjamin, and a small staff of domestic workers who rarely stayed longer than a season. The Raines maintained what neighbors described as a dignified distance from the community. They attended St. Mark's Episcopal Church on Sundays, made appropriate charitable contributions, and hosted the obligatory holiday gatherings. But few townspeople could claim genuine familiarity with the family. Eleanor Raines, in particular, was seldom seen outside the estate grounds after 1885, with Thomas explaining her absence as the result of a nervous condition requiring careful management of external stimulation. According to the ledgers of Dr. William Hayes, the Raines family physician, Eleanor suffered from what was then diagnosed as neurasthenia, a fashionable ailment among upper-class women characterized by fatigue, anxiety, and headaches. The treatment prescribed was typical of the era: rest, isolation, and avoidance of intellectual stimulation. Hayes's records, discovered during the renovation of his former office in 1959, reveal a troubling pattern in Eleanor's treatment. Initially, his notes describe a woman suffering from mild exhaustion and occasional melancholy, hardly unusual symptoms for a woman of her social standing and responsibilities. By late 1885, however, the tone of his observations shifts dramatically, with references to increasing agitation, fixed delusions regarding household matters, and a concerning preoccupation with the east wing of the residence. What the ledgers do not explain, however, is why Eleanor's condition appeared to worsen dramatically following the arrival of Evelyn. More curious still is Hayes's notation from December 1885, Mrs. R. continues to resist the treatments prescribed. Have consulted with Mr. R. regarding more aggressive interventions. He expresses concern about her fixation on the imagined presence of another woman in the household. Have recommended increased dosages of the sedative mixture. This entry predates any other known reference to Evelyn's existence, raising the disturbing possibility that Eleanor's delusions may have been the first acknowledgement of a presence the rest of the household would later be instructed to ignore. The first documented reference to Evelyn appears in a letter Thomas Raines wrote to his attorney in Philadelphia, dated March 12, 1886. The letter, discovered during a review of the attorney's archived correspondence in 1961, makes a brief but significant mention. The matter concerning Miss E has been arranged as discussed. She now resides in the East Wing, and the household staff have been appropriately instructed. No further context was provided, and subsequent correspondence made no mention of this mysterious addition to the household. The letter continues with unrelated business matters, suggesting that Thomas considered the arrangement regarding Evelyn to be concluded and requiring no further elaboration. The casual tone belies what would later prove to be an extraordinary effort to manage and eventually erase this woman's existence. The attorney's response, dated March 17th, contains only a brief acknowledgment. Regarding the matter of Miss E, I am pleased to hear that a suitable arrangement has been established. As discussed, no documentation of the particulars will be maintained in our files. This exchange confirms not only the deliberate nature of Evelyn's installation in the household, but also the intentional absence of any official record, a pattern that would continue throughout her time at the estate and complicate later efforts to reconstruct her story. The staff, however, noticed. According to an interview conducted in 1938 with Martha Grayson, who served as a housemaid at the Raines estate from 1885 to 1887, there was considerable confusion among the domestic workers regarding the young woman who appeared seemingly overnight. We were told she was a distant cousin of Mrs. Raines, who had fallen on hard times, Grayson recalled. But Mrs. Raines never acknowledged her presence, not once in all the time I worked there. It was as though they lived in separate worlds within the same house. Grayson's account describes a household functioning under an unspoken system of parallel realities, one in which Eleanor Raines existed in increasing isolation, another in which the mysterious Evelyn moved like a ghost through designated areas of the house, and a third in which Thomas Raines orchestrated the careful separation of these two worlds. Grayson's testimony, recorded by local historian Edward Penfield for his never-published manuscript Forgotten Faces of Millfield, provides one of the few first-hand accounts of Evelyn Raines. She described a woman in her early 20s, slender, with auburn hair typically worn in a simple chignon. She was pretty enough, but there was something distant about her eyes, like she was looking through you rather than at you, Grayson noted. She spent most days in the library or walking the grounds, always with a notebook in hand. She wrote constantly. The description of Evelyn as a writer corresponds with the later discovery of her journals, suggesting that the extensive written record she created may have been her primary means of maintaining a sense of self in an environment designed to deny her existence. Grayson also recalled that Evelyn spoke with a slight accent that she couldn't quite place. Not foreign exactly, but not local either. Her words were carefully chosen, as though she'd learned our way of speaking rather than being raised with it. What made the situation particularly unusual was the strict household policy regarding Evelyn. Staff were instructed never to address her directly unless she spoke first, which reportedly rarely happened. They were to ensure her meals were delivered to her rooms and to maintain her living quarters, but otherwise to minimize interaction. Most significantly, they were explicitly forbidden from discussing her presence with anyone outside the estate, a directive reinforced by a loyalty clause in their employment contracts that promised termination and withheld references for any breaches of household confidentiality. Grayson remembered that Thomas Raines personally reviewed these conditions with each staff member individually, emphasizing the consequences of indiscretion in a manner she described as not threatening exactly, but leaving no room for misunderstanding. According to Grayson, the household staff developed their own theories about Evelyn's identity and purpose in the house. Some thought she was Mr. Raines's mistress, kept separate from Mrs. Raines to avoid scandal, she recalled. Others believed she was a relative who had disgraced the family in some way and was being hidden from society. A few of the more superstitious maids even suggested she wasn't real at all, but some kind of ghost or hallucination we were all sharing. The The lack of clarity, combined with the strict instructions not to acknowledge or discuss her presence, created an atmosphere of silent tension throughout the house, an environment where reality itself seemed negotiable. Benjamin Raines, then a young man of 25 and newly returned from educational pursuits in Europe, appeared to be the only family member who openly acknowledged Evelyn's presence. According to Grayson, the two were occasionally seen in conversation in the estate's extensive gardens, though always at a proper distance and never with any inappropriate familiarity. There was something restrained about their interactions, she noted, like two people speaking across a great distance, even when standing just a few feet apart. This observation suggests that even Benjamin's acknowledgement of Evelyn may have been circumscribed by his father's unspoken rules, a partial recognition that still maintained certain boundaries. Benjamin himself maintained a detailed journal during this period, portions of which were discovered in a false bottom drawer of his desk following his death in 1932. The journal makes several references to E, but offers little substantive information beyond observations about her quiet demeanor and apparent intelligence. One entry, dated April 17, 1886, notes, "Encountered E in the library today. She had been reading Whitman, a curious choice for someone in her circumstances. When I remarked upon it, she replied that she found comfort in his assertion that the powerful play goes on and you may contribute a verse. I wonder what verse she imagines herself contributing from within these walls." The entry suggests a level of education and literary awareness in Evelyn that contradicts the image of a destitute relation dependent on family charity. "E asked about my time in Vienna today," reads another entry dated May 4, 1886. Her questions were remarkably astute for someone who, by all accounts, has had limited exposure to the world beyond Pennsylvania. Father noticed our conversation from the study window. He did not comment directly, but his disapproval was evident at dinner. Mother was absent again. Her empty chair grows more conspicuous with each passing week. This observation highlights not only the growing isolation of Eleanor Raines, but also Thomas's apparent concern about interactions between Benjamin and Evelyn, suggesting that whatever arrangement had been established for Evelyn, it did not include the development of relationships within the household. A later entry from June 1886 contains a more troubling observation. E appeared at breakfast today with a bandaged wrist. When I inquired about the injury, Father interjected that she had had a minor accident while arranging flowers. E said nothing to confirm or deny this explanation, but her eyes held a warning I have not seen before. Later, I observed her writing in her journal with no apparent difficulty, casting doubt on the severity of the supposed injury to her dominant hand. This suggests that whatever control Thomas exerted over Evelyn may have extended beyond mere social isolation to include physical consequences for unrecorded transgressions. The precise nature of Evelyn's relationship to the family remained unclear to the staff, and it seems intentionally obscured in the family's documentation. No record of her appears in the Millfield census of 1880 or 1890, nor in any church registries or school enrollment lists. A search of birth records in Pennsylvania and neighboring states conducted by researchers in the 1960s found no evidence of an Evelyn Raines or anyone matching her description born within the appropriate time frame. It was as though she had simply materialized at the Raines estate, with no prior existence acknowledged or documented. The mystery deepened when, in early 1887, Eleanor Raines's condition allegedly worsened, coinciding with what Benjamin cryptically referred to in his journal as the incident in the East Wing. His entry from February 12, 1887, reads only, "It has happened. The thing Father feared most, Mother has seen her." The walls between worlds have thinned beyond repair. The deliberately vague language offers few clues about what actually transpired, but suggests that Eleanor's awareness of Evelyn represented a failure in Thomas's carefully maintained system of separation, a breach in the parallel realities he had constructed within the household. A subsequent entry, dated February 15th, elaborates slightly. Father has consulted with Dr. Hayes. Mother is now confined to her rooms under constant sedation. Hayes believes her ravings about the other woman confirm his diagnosis of advancing nervous disorder. I said nothing to contradict this interpretation. To do so would be to admit complicity in Father's charade, yet to remain silent feels equally damning. E has not emerged from her room since the confrontation. The house holds its breath. This passage suggests that Eleanor's discovery of Evelyn was reframed as a manifestation of mental illness rather than an accurate perception of reality, a distortion that served to further isolate Eleanor while maintaining the secrecy surrounding Evelyn. Whatever transpired was serious enough that Thomas Raines dismissed the entire household staff over the course of the following month, replacing them with new workers recruited from as far away as Philadelphia, an unusual and costly decision that suggested a desire for complete discretion. None of the original staff were provided references, effectively blacklisting them from similar employment in the region. This sweeping action indicates the seriousness with which Thomas viewed the breach in his carefully constructed system of parallel realities within the household. Martha Grayson, who had been among the first to be dismissed, relocated to her sister's home in Harrisburg, where she found work as a seamstress. In her interview with Penfield, she recounted her final days at the estate. There were sounds from Mrs. Raines's rooms the night before we were let go. Not screaming exactly, but a kind of keening, low and constant, and there was movement throughout the house until dawn. Mr. Raines himself was carrying linens to the east wing, which was unheard of. The next morning he announced that my services would no longer be required, effective immediately. I never saw Evelyn again, though I did glimpse Benjamin watching from an upper window as I departed. He looked hollow somehow. Grayson's account suggests a night of crisis that resulted in changes to both Eleanor's and Evelyn's situations, followed by the systematic removal of all witnesses. The image of Thomas Raines, a wealthy man unaccustomed to domestic labor, personally transporting linens to the east wing, implies an urgency and need for discretion that transcended normal household protocol. Whatever occurred that night apparently required immediate attention and could not be entrusted to the staff who would soon be dismissed. Following the staff turnover, a period of unusual quiet descended upon the Raines estate. The new employees, according to town records, were prohibited from venturing into Millfield except on specific household errands, and local merchants were instructed to deliver goods directly to the service entrance rather than expecting staff to collect them in town. Thomas Raines continued to appear at his usual social and business obligations, though associates noted a new terseness in his manner. One business partner, Harold Thornton, wrote in a letter to his brother dated April 1887, "Raines seems altered of late. The customary veneer of civility remains intact, but beneath it lies something coiled and watchful. He terminates conversations abruptly when they stray from immediate business matters, and twice now he has checked his pocket watch upon receiving messages delivered by his manservant, as though operating on some precise and urgent schedule unknown to the rest of us." The estate itself took on an increasingly fortress-like quality during this period. Thomas commissioned the construction of a high stone wall around the property perimeter, replacing the more decorative wrought iron fencing that had previously defined the boundaries. New locks were installed on all exterior doors, and the groundskeeper was instructed to patrol the perimeter regularly, ostensibly to prevent trespassing. These changes, coming after nearly 40 years without significant security concerns, suggested a new fear of either intrusion from outside or escape from within, perhaps both. Benjamin Raines, meanwhile, withdrew from public life entirely for several months, emerging in the autumn of 1887 to announce his intention to pursue medical studies, a surprising development for a young man who had previously shown interest primarily in literature and the arts. According to correspondence with his former university classmate James Winthrop, Preserved in the Winthrop family papers and accessed by researchers in 1958, this change in direction came directly from his father. "The matter is not open for discussion," Benjamin wrote. "Father insists that the family would benefit from having a physician among its members, particularly one who understands the delicate nature of neurological and psychological ailments. After what happened with E, I cannot disagree. Some conditions, it seems, are better managed within the privacy of one's home than exposed to the inconsistent mercies of institutional care." The reference suggests that Thomas was positioning Benjamin to eventually take over the medical management of whatever situation existed within the household, a privatization of care that would further reduce outside awareness of the family's circumstances. In another letter to Winthrop, dated August 1887, Benjamin expressed more direct concerns. "I fear that in leaving I abandon not one but two women to a fate I cannot fully comprehend or prevent. Mother drifts further from reality each day, sedated into a twilight existence that barely qualifies as living. And E, what becomes of her now?" Father speaks of alternative arrangements being considered, but will not elaborate. "When I press him, he reminds me of my duty to the family name and legacy, as though these abstractions outweigh the flesh and blood reality of suffering I witness daily." This represents one of the few instances where Benjamin explicitly acknowledges the troubling nature of the situation, though even here his language remains guarded, avoiding direct accusations against his father. The reference to what happened with E is the last mention of Evelyn in any of Benjamin's known writings from this period. As he departed for medical training in Philadelphia in September 1887, the mysterious young woman appears to have vanished from the household entirely. No departure was documented, no forwarding address recorded, and no further reference made to her presence or absence. It was as though the parallel reality that had contained Evelyn had simply been folded away, leaving no trace of its existence. For the next 5 years, the Raines family maintained their position in Millfield society, though with an increasingly limited social footprint. Eleanor's public appearances ceased entirely, with Thomas eventually informing the minister at St. Mark's that his wife's health no longer permitted church attendance. Thomas himself continued his business affairs, though he gradually withdrew from leadership positions in various civic organizations, citing the need to devote more time to family matters. Associates noted that he aged considerably during this period, his hair turning completely white and deep lines appearing around his mouth and eyes, changes attributed to the stress of managing his wife's condition, but which might equally have resulted from other undocumented concerns. Benjamin returned from his medical training in 1891, establishing a small private practice that catered exclusively to a select clientele of wealthy families in the region. He took up residence not in the family estate, but in a modest house near his practice in town, visiting his parents weekly, according to a rigid schedule. Local observers noted that Benjamin had returned from his studies a changed man, more reserved, more formal, and noticeably distant in social settings. His practice specialized in nervous disorders, particularly those afflicting women, and he gained a reputation for advocating less restrictive treatments than were common at the time. Dr. Raines believes that confinement often exacerbates the very conditions it purports to treat, reported the Millfield Gazette in a profile published in early 1892. His approach emphasizes engagement with meaningful activity rather than isolation and restraint, a perspective increasingly supported by progressive medical authorities. The east wing of the Raines estate, where Evelyn had reportedly resided, was closed off entirely, with Thomas informing the new household staff that the area required structural repairs that would be addressed when circumstances permit. According to Agatha Wilson, who served as housekeeper from 1889 to 1893, the staff was strictly forbidden from entering that section of the house. "Mr. Raines had the connecting doors sealed," she recounted in a statement to the Millfield Historical Society in 1947. Not just locked, literally sealed with boards nailed across them, then wallpapered over so they barely showed. You'd have thought there was something contagious trapped in there, the way he wanted it contained. Wilson also reported that Thomas Raines would sometimes be seen entering the wing via an external door, carrying small packages and returning empty-handed hours later. These visits always occurred when Eleanor was heavily sedated, following her treatments, and other household members were away from the estate. The mystery of Evelyn Raines might have remained buried in the collective silence of the family were it not for a severe thunderstorm in June 1892. According to an account in the Millfield Gazette, dated June 17th, lightning struck the east chimney of the Raines estate, causing significant damage to the roof and upper portions of the east wing. The resulting fire required intervention from the town's volunteer fire brigade, the first time in nearly a decade that anyone outside the household had been permitted into that section of the house. The newspaper account describes Thomas Raines's unusual behavior upon being notified of the fire. Mr. Raines, upon receiving word of the incident while attending to business in town, reportedly became highly agitated, abandoning an important meeting with mining investors to return to the estate. Witnesses describe him repeatedly urging his driver to greater speed, displaying an urgency that seemed disproportionate to the relatively contained nature of the blaze. What the firefighters discovered, though not reported in the newspaper, was documented in the private journal of Brigade Captain Samuel Wilson, which was donated to the Millfield Historical Society in 1953. The relevant entry describes a wing that had been sealed not for repairs, but seemingly preserved exactly as it had been when last occupied. The room contained women's clothing, personal effects, and an extensive collection of journals, all apparently abandoned mid-use, as though the occupant had stepped out momentarily and never returned. There was something unnerving about the scene, Wilson wrote. A hairbrush with strands still caught in the bristles. A teacup with the remnants of what must have been the last cup ever poured there, now nothing but dust. Most disturbing was the writing desk, open, with a letter begun but never completed. Dearest B, it read, I fear that your father has discovered our... And there it ended, the pen having apparently been set down with the intention of continuing later. The scene Wilson describes suggests not a planned departure, but an interruption, something that caused Evelyn to abandon her writing mid-sentence, never to return to it. The unfinished letter, apparently addressed to Benjamin, the B, referenced, implies some form of conspiracy or secret understanding between them that Thomas had uncovered, possibly related to the incident in the East Wing Benjamin had cryptically mentioned in his journal. Wilson's account continues with observations about the unusual nature of the preserved space. The entire suite appeared frozen in time, as though the occupant might return at any moment. Garments laid out for the next day. Books marked with slim ribbons, awaiting the reader's return. A calendar from 1887 still displayed on the desk. Most curious of all was the state of preservation. No dust, no decay, beyond what the recent smoke had caused. Someone had been maintaining this room, keeping it ready, though for whom or what purpose, I cannot fathom. This detail contradicts Thomas's claim that the wing had been abandoned due to structural concerns, revealing instead a space that had been meticulously preserved, suggesting that whatever had happened to Evelyn, Thomas had either expected or hoped for her eventual return. Thomas Raines was in Philadelphia on business when the fire occurred. Upon his return and discovery of the brigade's access to the East Wing, he reportedly became apoplectic, demanding that all items be returned to exactly as they were found, and the wing resealed immediately. He insisted that nothing be removed, inventoried, or discussed, citing private family matters, and making veiled references to his considerable influence with the town council and judiciary. According to Wilson's account, Thomas went so far as to require each brigade member to sign a statement affirming that they had observed nothing unusual and would not discuss the contents of the wing with anyone, a demand most complied with out of deference to his position and power in the community. Benjamin Raines, however, had been present during the fire brigade's work. According to Wilson, the young doctor had entered the wing while the firefighters were still containing the last embers and had stood in the doorway of what had apparently been Evelyn's room, his expression unreadable. He made no move to enter fully, Wilson wrote, but stood as though anchored to the threshold, scanning the room with an intensity I have rarely witnessed. When I approached to inform him that we had the situation under control, he startled as though waking from a trance, nodded once without meeting my eyes, and withdrew without a word. He made no attempt to explain the preserved quarters or to assist in his father's subsequent efforts to ensure discretion from the brigade members. 2 days later, a notice appeared in the Millfield Gazette announcing that Dr. Benjamin Raines would be closing his medical practice indefinitely due to urgent family matters requiring his full attention. Patients with appointments were directed to contact Dr. Hayes for alternative arrangements, and no timeline for reopening was provided. According to Millfield Postmaster Gerald Murphy, interviewed in 1962, Benjamin was observed mailing several large parcels in the days following the fire. He seemed agitated, Murphy recalled, checking repeatedly over his shoulder as though expecting to be followed or observed. When I commented on the weight of one package, asking in jest if he was mailing bricks, he responded with unexpected sharpness that the contents were medical journals being returned to a colleague. His hand shook as he completed the postage forms. The same week, Thomas Raines was observed making multiple visits to Judge Edward Harmon, the county's most senior judicial official and a longtime business associate. The contents of their discussions were not documented, but subsequent events suggest they concerned the suppression of information about what had been discovered in the East Wing. Judge Harmon's clerk, Albert Green, later reported that following these meetings, the judge instructed him to remove and secure certain documents from public county records, a highly unusual directive that Green found troubling but felt unable to question given Harmon's authority. The next significant development came approximately 1 month later, when Millfield Township records indicate that Thomas Raines filed a petition for conservatorship over his son's affairs, citing concerns about Benjamin's mental stability and capacity for sound judgment. The petition, which was approved with unusual speed by Judge Harmon, effectively placed Benjamin's financial and legal affairs under his father's control, a dramatic step typically reserved for individuals demonstrating clear inability to manage their own interests. The petition itself contained minimal substantiating evidence, referring vaguely to increasingly erratic behavior and concerning fixations detrimental to family harmony. That such a serious legal action could be approved on such limited grounds speaks to Thomas's influence within the local judiciary and his determination to establish control over his son. No medical documentation supporting claims of Benjamin's instability was ever entered into the public record. Dr. William Hayes, still the family physician, declined to provide an affidavit, either supporting or refuting Thomas's petition, citing patient confidentiality. This abstention is notable, given that Hayes had been treating the Raines family for decades and would have been the obvious authority to confirm Benjamin's alleged condition. His silence suggests either uncertainty about the validity of Thomas's claims or unwillingness to commit himself in what he may have recognized as a power struggle between father and son. The only public statement from Benjamin himself came in the form of a letter to the editor of the Millfield Gazette, which the newspaper declined to publish, but which was preserved in the personal papers of editor Martin Fletcher. The letter provides a rare glimpse of Benjamin's perspective on the events unfolding around him, though his language remains measured even in this private communication. "I write not to dispute my father's legal actions," the letter stated, "as I recognize that resistance would only prolong a painful public spectacle. The conservation of one's reputation should never take precedence over the acknowledgment of one's deeds, particularly when those deeds have resulted in the erasure of another human being from the narrative of our community. The careful wording suggests that Benjamin was investigating Evelyn's disappearance, the former household member he references, and that his father's petition for conservatorship represented an attempt to halt this investigation rather than a genuine concern for Benjamin's mental health. I wish merely to state for the record that my recent inquiries regarding the circumstances surrounding the departure of a former household member reflect not derangement, but a commitment to truth that others might find inconvenient. In a postscript, Benjamin added a more personal note. To those patients who have entrusted me with their care, I offer my sincere apologies for this abrupt cessation of service. Please know that my advocacy for humane and dignified treatment continues, even as my ability to provide it is temporarily constrained. There are wounds that medicine alone cannot heal, and silences that echo more loudly than any cry of pain. This suggests that Benjamin viewed his work as a physician as connected to his personal experience with the Rains family dynamics, perhaps seeing in his patients' suffering reflections of what he had witnessed at home. Following the approval of the conservatorship, Benjamin was reportedly confined to the Rains estate, with Thomas informing neighbors and former patients that his son was recovering from nervous exhaustion and was not receiving visitors for the foreseeable future. Household staff during this period were again replaced, with the new employees reportedly brought from even further afield, some from as far away as Baltimore, suggesting Thomas's growing concern about local knowledge of family affairs. According to delivery records from Millfield's pharmacy, significant quantities of sedatives and sleeping draughts were regularly delivered to the estate during this period, ostensibly for Eleanor's ongoing treatment, but in quantities that suggested additional usage. Benjamin's confinement represented a dramatic reversal of the independence he had established since returning from his medical training. From a respected physician with his own practice and residence, he was reduced to the status of an invalid under his father's control, a transformation that paralleled, in some respects, the situation of the mysterious Evelyn. Whether this connection occurred to Benjamin is not documented, but the similarities are striking. A younger person whose autonomy was systematically eliminated by Thomas Rains, whose presence was gradually erased from public awareness, and whose reality was entirely controlled by the patriarch of the household. During this period of Benjamin's confinement, Thomas Rains undertook several unusual legal actions. County records indicate that he updated his will, established several anonymous trusts with unspecified beneficiaries, and transferred certain property holdings to corporate entities controlled by associates rather than maintaining them in his own name. These financial maneuvers, while not overtly suspicious, suggest a man preparing for contingencies, redistributing assets in ways that would make them difficult to trace or contest. The timing, coming immediately after Benjamin's forced return to the estate, implies a connection to whatever Thomas feared might emerge from his son's investigations. The final public chapter of the Evelyn Rains mystery came in October 1892, when a pre-dawn fire of suspicious origin destroyed much of the east wing of the estate. The Millfield Volunteer Fire Brigade responded, but the blaze had advanced significantly before their arrival. By daybreak, the wing had been reduced to a charred shell. Notably, no injuries were reported, and the Rains family, Thomas, Eleanor, and Benjamin, were all accounted for, having been safely evacuated to the undamaged West Wing. The Millfield Gazette reported that Thomas Rains appeared composed despite the significant property damage, expressing gratitude that no lives were lost and assuring the community that the family would rebuild in due course. The official report filed by Fire Inspector James Morgan attributed the fire to faulty wiring recently installed as part of ongoing renovations. However, Morgan's personal diary, discovered among his effects after his death in 1928, tells a different story. In an entry dated October 12, 1892, Morgan wrote, "The fire at Rains was no accident. No wiring was being installed in that wing. It had been sealed for years by Raines's own admission. The point of origin was clearly the bedroom containing the young woman's effects, and accelerants had been used. TR made it abundantly clear that my family's continued prosperity in this town depended on the official determination of accidental causes. May God forgive me for what I've written in that report. This entry suggests not only that the fire was deliberately set, but that Thomas Raines himself may have been responsible, a final, irreversible erasure of the physical space that had contained evidence of Evelyn's existence. Morgan's diary contains a further observation that was not included in any official documentation. Young Dr. Raines was not, as reported, evacuated with his parents. He was already outside when we arrived, standing in the garden some distance from the house, watching the flames with an expression I cannot adequately describe. Not shock or grief, but something closer to resignation. His clothing was immaculate, suggesting he had not been roused suddenly from sleep as the elder Raines claimed. When I approached to inquire about his well-being, he said only, "Some things refuse to remain buried, Inspector, no matter how deeply we inter them." I did not include this encounter in my report, as I confess I do not know what to make of it. This account raises questions about Benjamin's role in the events of that night, whether he had advanced knowledge of the fire, whether he might even have been involved in setting it, or whether he simply recognized it as his father's inevitable response to the earlier exposure of Evelyn's preserved rooms. In the aftermath of the fire, Thomas Raines announced plans to demolish the remains of the east wing rather than rebuild it. By December, all visible traces of that section of the house had been removed, the rubble cleared, and the ground leveled. The following spring, an extensive garden was planted where the wing had stood, effectively erasing the physical space Evelyn had once occupied. Thomas commissioned an elaborate fountain as the centerpiece of this new garden, a structure featuring a female figure pouring water from an urn, her face rendered in a classical style that conveyed serene anonymity rather than individual identity. Whether this monument represented acknowledgement, memorial, or mockery of the woman who had once resided in that space remains open to interpretation. Benjamin Raines remained under his father's conservatorship for nearly a year following the fire. In September 1893, however, county records indicate that Thomas amended the arrangement, permitting Benjamin to relocate to Boston, Massachusetts, where he would practice medicine under the supervision of a colleague of Thomas's choosing. The amendment stipulated that Benjamin would receive a modest allowance conditional upon continued adherence to appropriate discretion regarding family matters, and regular correspondence confirming ongoing compliance with treatment recommendations. These conditions effectively established a form of controlled exile, allowing Benjamin physical distance from Millfield while maintaining financial and professional constraints that ensured his continued silence. The amendment coincided with a significant decline in Eleanor Raines's health, as documented in Dr. Hayes's records. Entries from August 1893 describe her as increasingly non-responsive and refusing nourishment except when coaxed by her husband. Hayes prescribed a reduced regimen of sedatives, noting that the patient's diminished physical condition no longer supports previous dosages, but his records indicate that Thomas insisted on maintaining the established protocol. This insistence raises questions about whether Eleanor's deterioration resulted from her condition itself or from the treatments ostensibly designed to manage it, treatments that Thomas appeared determined to continue despite medical concerns about their appropriateness. Benjamin left Millfield the following week, according to a brief notice in the social pages of the Gazette. He would never return to the town during his father's lifetime. In a letter to his former colleague, Dr. James Harris, dated October 1893, Benjamin wrote, "The terms of my release are clear, if unwritten. Distance purchased with silence. Freedom contingent upon forgetting, or at least pretending to forget. I have accepted these conditions not out of cowardice, as you suggested in your last correspondence, but out of recognition that justice for the absent cannot be achieved through the destruction of the living." Father holds more hostages than he knows. The reference to hostages is ambiguous, possibly referring to Eleanor, whose care remained under Thomas's control, but potentially suggesting other individuals unknown to Harris whose welfare might depend on Benjamin's compliance. Thomas and Eleanor Raines continued to reside at the modified estate until Thomas's death from apoplexy in 1903. Eleanor followed less than 6 months later, with her death certificate citing general debility as the cause. Both were buried in the family plot at Millfield Cemetery, their substantial headstones bearing only their names, dates, and the inscription, "At Rest." The proximity of Eleanor's death to Thomas's raised eyebrows among some community members, particularly given her relatively young age of 58, but no formal investigation was conducted. Dr. Hayes, who signed the death certificate, maintained that her passing resulted from the natural progression of her long-standing condition, exacerbated by grief over her husband's death. Whether this assessment represented his genuine medical opinion or a final act of complicity in the Raines family narrative remains unclear. The estate remained unoccupied for several years, managed by a trust established in Thomas's will. In 1907, however, records indicate that Benjamin Raines, now a respected neurologist in Boston, filed a petition to assume control of the property. The petition was granted, though Benjamin never returned to live in the house. Instead, he arranged for its contents to be cataloged, with selected personal items shipped to his Boston residence and the remainder sold at auction. The estate itself was maintained, but left vacant, with a caretaker employed to prevent deterioration of the grounds and structure. According to local sources, Benjamin visited the property only once following his father's death, a brief, solitary visit in the winter of 1904, during which he reportedly spent several hours walking the gardens that had replaced the east wing before departing without entering the main house. It was during the cataloging process that the trunk containing Evelyn's journal was discovered, hidden in a concealed attic space that had survived both fires. According to the inventory prepared by Arthur Jenkins, the agent overseeing the process, the trunk was found behind a false panel in the attic ceiling, a hiding place so carefully constructed that it was discovered only when a worker accidentally damaged the surrounding plasterwork while assessing water damage from a leaking roof. The trunk itself was secured with 3 separate locks, for which no keys were found among Thomas Raines's effects. Jenkins reported that he had the locks forced only after telegraphing Benjamin for authorization, which was granted with instructions that the trunk and its contents were to be shipped to Boston unopened, with no inventory of the interior to be conducted. The journal, along with the other items in the trunk, was among the personal effects Benjamin had shipped to his Beacon Hill residence on November 18, 1907. The shipment was noted in his household accounts as having arrived in good condition, seals intact, suggesting that Benjamin had specifically instructed that the trunk not be opened during transit. That same day, his appointment calendar shows all professional engagements canceled for the remainder of the week, an unusual action for a physician with an active practice, indicating the significance he attached to examining the trunk's contents. What Benjamin discovered in those pages can only be pieced together through fragmentary evidence. His own journal from this period, which came to light during the settlement of his estate in 1932, indicates that he spent several weeks reading and rereading Evelyn's writings. "The truth is both more mundane and more monstrous than I had imagined," he wrote on December 4, 1907. "It was never a matter of madness, but of convenience. Father created a prison without bars, a confinement without documentation, an erasure so complete that even I, who suspected, could not fully grasp its dimensions until now." This entry suggests that whatever Benjamin discovered in Evelyn's journal confirmed his suspicions about his father's actions, while perhaps revealing motivations or details he had not anticipated. A subsequent entry, dated December 7th, elaborates. E's account of her arrival at the estate differs significantly from the narrative Father constructed. There was no charity in her presence there, no distant relation being sheltered through family obligation. She came not as a supplicant, but as a claimant, bearing evidence that threatened the very foundation of Father's carefully constructed public persona. The irony is exquisite and terrible. He imprisoned her for knowing his secrets, and in doing so, created a greater secret still. This cryptic observation suggests that Evelyn possessed information potentially damaging to Thomas Raines, information significant enough to motivate her effective imprisonment within the household rather than risk her speaking freely in the wider world. Benjamin's writings from this period frequently reference a moral struggle regarding what actions he should take based on his discoveries. To reveal all now would be to destroy lives beyond counting, he wrote on December 12th. Not only the reputations of the dead, which perhaps deserve no protection, but the welfare of the living who have built their existences upon foundations they do not realize are false. Yet to maintain silence is to perpetuate the very erasure Father engineered, to become, in effect, his accomplice across time. There must be a middle path, some way to acknowledge truth without unleashing its full destructive force. This entry indicates that whatever Benjamin learned from Evelyn's journal had implications beyond the immediate Raines family, potentially affecting other members of the Millfield community or beyond. Based on Benjamin's subsequent actions and limited direct quotes from Evelyn's journal, historical researchers have constructed a theory about Evelyn Raines's true identity and circumstances. Dr. cited Margaret Winters, writing in the Pennsylvania Historical Review in 1964, proposed that Evelyn was not, in fact, a distant relation of the family, but rather Eleanor Raines's younger sister, a woman whose existence had been deliberately obscured from public records through Thomas Raines's influence and connections. This theory is supported by the resemblance Martha Grayson noted between Evelyn and Eleanor, as well as by the extreme reaction Eleanor reportedly had upon discovering Evelyn's presence in the household, a reaction that might be expected upon encountering a sister one had been told was dead or otherwise permanently lost. According to Winters's analysis, supported by census anomalies and patterns of omission in church records, Eleanor had a sister approximately 15 years her junior. This sister, possibly born Elizabeth Preston, Eleanor's maiden name, would have been of an age matching Martha Grayson's description of Evelyn. Winters hypothesizes that Elizabeth Evelyn may have been institutionalized at a young age for some form of socially unacceptable behavior or condition, with the family subsequently acting as though she had never existed, a not uncommon practice among wealthy families seeking to avoid the stigma of mental illness or moral impropriety. Winters suggests that Evelyn may have been released from institutional care as a young adult, possibly after the death of Eleanor and Evelyn's parents, and sought out her sister, only to be intercepted by Thomas Raines, who recognized her as a threat to the social position he had established. Rather than risk public acknowledgement of this inconvenient relation, he created a controlled environment within his own home where she could be monitored and prevented from making any claims or connections that might embarrass the family. This arrangement would explain both the strict limitations placed on Evelyn's interactions with staff and the complete separation maintained between her and Eleanor, a separation that, if Winters is correct, represented an almost unimaginable cruelty to both sisters. The practice of hiding difficult family members was not uncommon among wealthy families of the era, Winters wrote. What makes the Raines case exceptional is the extent to which Thomas appears to have gone to erase all evidence of Evelyn's existence, not merely her presence. This suggests something beyond the usual concerns about social embarrassment, perhaps a threat to his carefully constructed narrative of respectability or to his control over the family's affairs. Winters notes that this level of erasure typically indicates that the person represents not merely an embarrassment, but an active threat, someone whose very existence challenges fundamental aspects of the family narrative or claims. Benjamin Raines' writings support elements of this theory. In a letter to his former medical colleague Dr. James Harris, Dated January 1908 and preserved in the Harris family papers, Benjamin wrote, "What I discovered in E.'s journal confirms my worst suspicions about my father's character and actions. She was never ill in the way he claimed, merely inconvenient. Her crime was nothing more than refusing to submit to the role assigned to her, and for that she was effectively erased from existence while still drawing breath. More disturbing still is my mother's complicity through inaction, though whether born of fear or indifference, I cannot determine." This passage suggests that whatever condition had been attributed to Evelyn to justify her confinement was a fabrication, a convenient label applied to legitimize control rather than a genuine diagnosis requiring treatment. In the same letter, Benjamin makes a cryptic reference to arrangements made to correct, insofar as possible, the injustice done to E. Historical records indicate that in February 1908, he established a substantial trust fund benefiting a private care facility outside Baltimore. The documentation for the trust refers only to the ongoing care and comfort of a patient whose identity must remain confidential for her protection. The facility in question, Meadowbrook Retreat, was known for its relatively progressive approaches to mental health care, emphasizing dignity and comfort over the restraint and isolation common in many institutions of the era. The timing of this trust's establishment, coming just months after Benjamin's discovery of Evelyn's journal, suggests a connection between the two events. Whether the patient referenced was indeed Evelyn herself, somehow located and provided for after years of disappearance, or someone else connected to the Raines family, remains unconfirmed. The trust was structured to continue in perpetuity, with provisions ensuring that funds would be redirected to general patient welfare if the specific intended beneficiary should no longer require support. An arrangement that prevented the identification of the individual through the cessation of payments upon their death. Benjamin never made any public statement about his discoveries or actions, maintaining the same silence his father had demanded, though perhaps for different reasons. In private correspondence with Dr. Harris from 1910, he obliquely referenced his decision. "You ask why I do not bring what I know into the light of public scrutiny. I can offer only this. There are wounds that exposure cannot heal, only deepen. E has endured more than enough without becoming a spectacle for public consumption, a curiosity for newspapers to dissect and discard. What remains of her dignity would not survive such attention, nor would the fragile peace she has perhaps finally found. Justice and healing are not always compatible aims." This suggests that Benjamin's silence may have stemmed from concern for Evelyn's well-being rather than fear of consequences to himself or the family reputation, a motivation markedly different from his father's. Benjamin continued his medical practice in Boston, specializing in the humane treatment of women diagnosed with psychological conditions and advocating for reforms in institutional care. His published papers, while never directly referencing his family experiences, consistently emphasized the importance of autonomy and dignity in treatment approaches. "Confinement without purpose or engagement is not treatment but punishment," he wrote in a 1912 article for the New England Medical Journal. "We must question whether our methods serve healing or merely containment, whether our diagnoses reflect genuine illness or merely behaviors society finds inconvenient." These principles, articulated throughout his professional career, suggest that his encounters with Evelyn and his mother had profoundly shaped his understanding of how psychological distress could be weaponized as a means of control. He never married and left no direct heirs upon his death from pneumonia in 1932 at the age of 71. His will directed that his considerable personal fortune, built through both inheritance and his successful medical practice, be divided among various reformist medical institutions and research foundations focused on humane treatment approaches. Notably, the will included specific provisions prohibiting any of these funds from being used for treatments involving extended isolation, physical restraint, or other practices that prioritize institutional convenience over patient dignity. a final testament to the values that appeared to have guided his later life. The Raines estate in Millfield was eventually sold to developers in 1917, with the proceeds directed to Benjamin's Medical Research Foundation. The property was subdivided and the remaining structure of the main house converted into a small hotel that operated until 1942, when it was destroyed in yet another fire, this one conclusively determined to be the result of faulty electrical wiring. Local residents reported that the hotel had struggled to attract guests throughout its operation, with visitors frequently cutting short their stays after complaining of unsettling atmospheres and disturbances during the night. Whether these reports reflected genuine phenomena, the power of suggestion based on local rumors about the house's history, or simply the challenges of converting a private residence to commercial use, they contributed to the property's reputation as somehow tainted by its past. Today, all that remains of the original estate is a stone marker at what was once the entrance to the property, now situated in a residential neighborhood of modest homes built in the post-war period. The marker, erected by the Millfield Historical Society in 1958, makes no mention of Evelyn Raines or the mysteries surrounding the family. It simply reads, "Site of the Raines Estate, 1847-1942." This modest acknowledgment offers no hint of the complex and disturbing history that unfolded on the property, a final manifestation of the erasure that characterized Evelyn's existence within those now vanished walls. The trunk containing Evelyn's journal, photographs, and pressed flowers was not among the items inventoried in Benjamin's estate following his death. According to his housekeeper of many years, Abigail Foster, interviewed for an oral history project in 1960, Benjamin kept the trunk locked in his private study and would occasionally spend hours examining its contents, particularly on the anniversary of what Foster believed to be his departure from Millfield. He would sit there with those papers and those photographs, and sometimes I would hear him talking, as though carrying on a conversation with someone who wasn't there, Foster recalled. The only thing he ever said about it was, "Some voices, once silenced, should be given the courtesy of being heard, even if only by one person." This observation suggests that Benjamin maintained a form of relationship with Evelyn through her writings, perhaps the only relationship possible given whatever had ultimately happened to her. I wasn't to tell the executor or anyone else, just make that call and say only, "The doctor has completed his work." Then someone would come for the trunk, and I was to ask no questions and tell no one about it afterward. This arrangement suggests that Benjamin had established some form of contingency plan for Evelyn's journal, a plan designed to ensure that these records of her existence would be preserved but would not become public or fall into the hands of those who might misuse or destroy them. Foster also reported that Benjamin had specific instructions regarding the trunk. He told me that if anything should happen to him suddenly, I was to telephone a certain number in Baltimore. No name, just a number he had me memorize. Following Benjamin's death, the trunk disappeared. It was not listed in the formal inventory of his possessions, nor was it mentioned in his will. Foster reported that in the days between Benjamin's death and the arrival of the estate administrators, she observed a woman she did not recognize visiting the house and departing with what appeared to be the trunk. She described the visitor as elderly but still striking, with unusual amber-colored eyes. No record exists of who this woman might have been or where the trunk and its contents might have gone. The timing of the visit, coming before the formal settlement of Benjamin's estate began, suggests that Foster had indeed made the call as instructed, and that the contingency plan Benjamin had established was executed as he intended. The case of Evelyn Raines remains one of the most disturbing examples of how completely a person could be erased from history through the determined efforts of those with sufficient power and influence. That her existence is known at all is due only to the persistence of her apparent nephew, whose own life was shaped and ultimately defined by his efforts to understand her fate. The fragmentary evidence that remains raises more questions than it answers, suggesting a narrative of confinement, silencing, and erasure that was all too common in an era when women's autonomy was easily pathologized and family reputation took precedence over individual well-being. In 1966, during excavations for a community swimming pool in the area that once comprised the gardens planted over the demolished East Wing, workers discovered a small metal box containing a cameo brooch and a handwritten note. The note, badly damaged by water and largely illegible, contained only one clearly discernible sentence: "Remember that silence is not the same as absence." The handwriting, when compared to the few preserved samples of Benjamin's medical notations, showed no match. Whether this final communication was from Evelyn herself, placed before the wing's destruction, or from someone else entirely, remains one more unanswered question in a case defined by deliberate obscurity. Perhaps most disturbing is how easily and completely such erasure could be accomplished, a reminder that for much of history, a person's existence was verified not by governmental documentation or digital footprints, but by the willingness of others to acknowledge their presence and preserve their memory. For Evelyn Raines, that acknowledgement came too late, if at all, leaving behind only echoes of a life systematically removed from the record. A ghost created not by death, but by the calculated denial of her very existence. The Millfield Historical Society maintains a small file in the case, consisting primarily of Martha Grayson's interview, Captain Wilson's journal entries, and Dr. Winters's research notes. Occasional inquiries about Evelyn Raines still reach the Society, typically from students researching historical patterns of women's confinement or family control. The Society's official position remains neutral regarding the more speculative elements of the case, acknowledging the limited primary sources available while noting the striking consistency of those accounts that do exist. What emerges from even this fragmentary record is a portrait of systematic erasure so thorough that it becomes, paradoxically, its own form of evidence, the absence that speaks as loudly as presence. As for the Raines family line, it ended with Benjamin's death. The considerable family fortune was dispersed among various medical research foundations and charitable trusts, with no personal bequests, aside from modest provisions for long-term staff. The family plot in Millfield Cemetery contains only the graves of Thomas and Eleanor, with no marker for the woman who once lived in their East Wing, writing constantly in journals that would eventually reveal at least some fragment of her truth. Whether Evelyn Raines was laid to rest elsewhere under another name, or whether her final disposition remains as obscured as much of her life, is yet another unanswered question in this case of deliberate historical erasure. For those who study the case, the most haunting aspect remains not what is known, but what was successfully hidden, the words in Evelyn's journal that Benjamin never shared, the precise nature of the incident in the East Wing, and the ultimate fate of the woman herself. In the silence surrounding these questions lies the true horror of Evelyn Raines's story. Not that something terrible may have happened to her, but that whatever did happen was deemed less important than maintaining the illusion that she had never existed at all. And perhaps in the end, that is the most disturbing realization this case offers, that the most complete form of erasure is not the destruction of evidence, but the cultivation of a world in which no one thinks to look for it in the first place. In a society that valued reputation above truth and conformity, above authenticity, Evelyn Raines became a non-person, removed not only from her place in the world, but from the very record of having ever occupied it. That fragments of her story eventually emerged represents not triumph, but tragedy. A glimpse of a life deliberately obscured, a voice intentionally silenced, and a person systematically denied the most fundamental acknowledgement of all, that she existed. The amber-eyed woman who retrieved the trunk from Benjamin's home remains perhaps the final keeper of Evelyn's complete story, assuming the trunk contained the full account of her experiences rather than just the fragments that historical research has pieced together. Whether this woman was Evelyn herself, somehow surviving into old age after decades of hidden existence, or someone else connected to her story. We may never know. Like so much else in this case, her identity remains just beyond the reach of historical confirmation, another shadow at the edges of a narrative characterized by deliberate obscurity. What remains clear, however, is that the story of Evelyn Raines represents more than just a historical curiosity or a local mystery. It stands as a stark reminder of how power operates not just through what it does, but through what it prevents from being known, through the narratives it suppresses, the voices it silences, and the realities it refuses to acknowledge. In this sense, the horror of Evelyn's story lies not in what happened within the walls of the Raines estate, but in how completely those events could be removed from collective memory, a erasure so thorough that it nearly succeeded in making her not just forgotten, but fundamentally unknowable.